Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Spring 2021 West Virginia Cybersecurity and Game Developers Expo. I am Patrick Smith, and here today for our Game Developers keynote, we have Christian Allen, who's an experienced and BAFTA award-winning AAA game designer and creative director. He currently works at Epic Games, but prior to that, he actually was a lead designer, creative director, and design director of several AAA games for Ubisoft, Bungie, and Warner Brothers, as well as running his own independent development studio, Cerulean LLC. Did I get that right? Cerulean?
Cerulean, but close enough.
Cerulean. Well, I had to pause there for a second to really think about it. He shipped multiple titles on console, PC, mobile, and VR. As I've always heard him say, the real experience is shipping something. You can ship an empty box, but get that experience on shipping something. His role at Epic includes utilizing his extensive game development experience, assisting and advising indie game developers, hopefully like yourself pretty soon, into utilizing the Unreal Engine to ship the best experiences possible. So, hello, Christian. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us here today. I will pull up your presentation and let you tell people all about your journey into game design and how they can get into it.
Awesome. Well, good morning. I guess good afternoon for my friends on the East Coast. I want to say thanks to the West Virginia Game Developers Expo again for having me back and inviting me to keynote. I want to first apologize for all of my ums and ahs while presenting. As an evangelist at Epic, have been presenting all around the country and North America to various folks, and I still haven't quite gotten the hang of this digital presenting from a box. I'm much more skilled at presenting to folks in real life, but even after a year of this current situation that we're in, still really haven't gotten used to this format. So with that, speaking to the organizers this year about the content of the presentation, really wanted to focus on some live tips for folks that are interested in game design. So I'm not going to be doing a technical demonstration today or telling you about the latest and greatest in what's going on with Unreal. Although as a plug, you should go check out the MetaHuman Creator that was released into early access yesterday, so you can get in and start playing with the latest and greatest content creation tools that we've got out there paired with Unreal Engine. So my talk today is on being a game designer, really a lot of the kind of high level questions that folks that are interested in getting into the games industry ask a lot about game design. And part of the thing that inspired what I'm going to talk about today is when I Google searched how to be a game designer or what is a game designer. So I'm going to talk a lot about this. So before that, getting into that, I'll talk a little bit about my background. So this is me. I'm Christian Allen. That's my Twitter handle at Cerulean. I am evangelist at Epic Games, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means after I talk about my background. So I've been in the industry since the late 90s. I actually started as a modder working on mods for Rainbow Six, and I spun that into a game development career as a game designer. So I was at Ubisoft for a few years where I worked as from designer all the way up to creative director on the Tom Clancy franchise, focusing on Ghost Recon on the Xbox. After that, I went to Bungie. I was there for a few years. I worked at Warner Brothers on a few different titles, Overbrook Entertainment, which is Will Smith's production company, my own studio, Cerulean LLC, and like I said, now I am at Epic Games. So the games that I worked on, this is a few of them. Like I mentioned, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon series was my primary focus at Ubisoft. At Bungie, I was design lead on Halo Reach. Warner Brothers, I worked on a bunch of different IPs, Mad Max, Lord of the Rings, some DC content. With Overbrook, I was working on After Earth, which was a science fiction movie franchise. Worked on the mobile games that went along with that, and then when I ran my own studio is when I switched to Unreal. So all the technology I'd used prior to that was proprietary game engines. And when I went indie, started my own studio, moved over to Unreal 3 for our first game on PC and Xbox, and then moved up to Unreal 4 on Epsilon, which was an early access game, and Hotel Blind, which was an experimental VR game. Since then, I joined Epic as an evangelist. And so my role as an evangelist has two kind of primary facing roles. One is the public facing side, which is doing presentations like this. I travel around the country and around North America, US and Canada, and meet up with our Unreal meetup groups, which are organized locally. Also do a lot of speaking at colleges and game conferences just on Unreal Engine, the Epic ecosystem, and the games industry in general. Obviously, with COVID, that has been curtailed to presentations like this. And then on the more private side, the evangelism team works to support smaller and indie game developers using the Unreal Engine in a variety of tasks. I focus personally on games, although obviously Unreal Engine is used in multiple applications, architectural, product development, virtual reality, augmented reality, medical, government, simulation, movie, film, production. Actually, my last presentation to the West Virginia group was on all the different applications and industries that 3D development technology like Unreal is being used in, and all the career opportunities. So I highly recommend you go check that out if you're thinking about the different opportunities outside of games that you can apply the skill set that you'll pick up in game development in those other applications. So the topics today, basically, these are the 3 points that I'm going to cover at the high level of what is a game designer. The high level is, what is a game designer? That's one of the biggest questions that I get a lot. The next topic will be the design skill sets, things that you can that are crucial for your breaking in as a game designer and your success as a game designer. And then 3 things that you can do moving forward to help bolster that skill set and to move forward. And I hope that you'll think about any questions that you have while I'm talking. Most of this presentation is going to be me talking over slides. I didn't have a lot of good videos this time to back up, although I do have one to open up. So, when people ask, the best way to become a game designer, I think we pretty much nailed this in the 90s with this ad that we'll play real quick, just to give you an idea what people used to think.
Oh, hurry up, man. Boss is coming in.
Dude, almost got it.
Hey guys, finished testing that game yet? I've got another one I need designed.
We just finished level 3 and need to tighten up the graphics a little bit.
Great.
Hey, I can't believe we got jobs doing this.
I know. And my mom said I would never get anywhere with these games.
Call Westwood College online, 800-914-8582. That's 914-8582. Call now.
So when I worked at Red Storm on Ghost Recon, we actually had a joke line that would go around whenever we were late on something and people would ask what we're doing. We'd say we were tightening up the graphics on level 3. That was based on this commercial. Another thing I love for that at the end, where it mentions which states that this college has been banned by the local attorney general. So that's always a good sign of the school that you want to go to. But that was representative of a lot of the ideas of what a game designer was. These people sitting in what looks like a hallway playing video games to polish up the graphics on level 3. And of course, they're testers and designers, and they do everything. And that kind of gets to the first point of defining what is a game designer. And this is not just confusing to you. This is confusing to pretty much everybody, even within game studios and within game development teams, and even within game designers. There's lots of discussion and arguments about what makes a game designer, who is a game designer. All these kinds of things, whether the term should even exist. We actually had a roundtable at GDC. I believe it was around 2004, 2005. One of the roundtables, I believe it was sponsored by the IGDA, was an attempt by a bunch of industry veterans to sit around a table for a couple hours and define what a game designer was. Excuse me. And the interesting thing is that it came down to some of the things that I'm going to talk to you today. But the first thing I want to put to rest is what a game designer is not. One of the things that people will kick around or have pictured in their mind as a game designer is the quote unquote idea guy, the idea person that kicks back, puts their feet up and says, okay, what game should we make next? You know what? I really love real-time strategy games, and real-time strategy games are awesome. And you know what? We haven't made a real-time strategy game that is set in the Napoleonic Wars, and I would love to make a Napoleonic real-time strategy game. And wouldn't that be super cool? And okay, I decided, hey, everybody, we're making a Napoleonic real-time strategy game. So I'm going to go and sit and write all my ideas down on a piece of paper for a couple months. And when I come back, all you folks will build this game that I came up with. That is in no reality what a game designer does. The only case that this may be the case if you're a solo indie dev and you want to spend a couple weeks, sitting in your chair dreaming up what you're going to work on next. Although I have some alternative theories about more efficient ways to reach that goal. But on both AAA teams and indie teams, there is no role of just sitting around and coming up with ideas. There are more ideas about what should be done in video games and what kind of video games to be made and what kind of features to be made in games than there are people involved in the industry. So there are no lack of ideas from artists and programmers and producers and fans and community managers and marketing people and business people. They don't need to sit and pay someone to come up with super cool ideas. They need to pay someone to be excellent game designers and execute on what a good game designer does. So with that being said, when I say, what does a game designer do? This definition came from an article when I Googled what is a game designer this week while I was working on this presentation. An article came up from a few years ago, and they said this was their definition, that a game designer is the creative driver responsible for bringing a game to life. They're generally a cross between a writer, an artist, and a programmer. And the reason that this caught my eye, that second sentence, they're generally a cross between a writer, an artist, and a programmer, goes back to that roundtable that we had at GDC back 15 years ago now, where basically by the end of the 2 hours of all these industry, people with a lot of experience that have shipped a lot of games, came down to this concept of like a game designer is a Renaissance person because, they know philosophy and they know art and they know writing and they know programming and they know game technology and they know production and they know all these things. And they're going to be this holy grail of like, what is game development? And of course, that's a completely unrealistic, idea of what any of us can be. If you are that, gifted, then you probably don't need a team of people around you. And if you are that gifted and you do need a team, then you would just, you would be rich and have raised tons of money and you could just send forth your armies. But so I should have hit the screen again because I think that's a terrible representation of what a game designer does. And it was easy for me to find that and then say, oh, that's going to be a good example of what a game designer isn't, of this person that brings games to life and they're generally know everything, which is always great to say. But I had to then come up with my own definition of what a game designer is. And so I worked on that a bit and I came up with a statement. Now I'm going to preface with this. I'm going to say that this is what I came up with. And a little bit later, I'll talk about this more. Everything a game designer does is colored by the folks that they interact with over the years. And if you are a good game designer, you're naturally a sponge for good statements, good ideas, good philosophies. You listen to the ones that resonate with people, you pick them up, you absorb them, and you tend to regurgitate them back to the team. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So I may have heard this exact line stated by someone at some presentation somewhere and absorbed it and just regurgitating it back to you. But the statement that I came up with is that a game designer is the vision holder of the player experience for the whole or part of the game. Now, of course, we'll need to parse that out a little bit as a game designer. This is how I tend to write. what I'm stating here is basically there's kind of three key statements. That the game designer is the vision holder. And what we mean by vision holder, what I mean by vision holder is they are looking at all the parts of the game or the parts of the game that they're responsible for and seeing how they all interact together and making sure that that is a coherent and playable and fun and marketable and sellable and executable experience. So they're holding that vision, and that vision of what the game is or what that part of the game is basically a litmus test. As things come in, you can test that. Does this help the vision? Does this bolster the vision of what we're trying to do, or does it conflict with the vision? And if it conflicts with the vision, do we need to adjust the vision? Do we need to adjust the thing that we're looking at? Do we need to cut this feature? That's what I mean by vision holder. Not the person sitting there, my vision is, it's like, this is the vision of what we are trying to accomplish. And does this thing that we're talking about meet that vision and support that vision? And that vision holder of the player experience, that I think is a key thing that that at least I approach game design from, and creative direction in general, is that I feel that my role as a game designer is to be representative of the player and the player experience. And when I say player experience, I mean, everything when the player is interacting from the game, from the first time they pick up the controller or boot up the game, all the way through when they hit start and they start playing to when they hit exit and they're out. All of those things are part of the player experience. And the game designer needs to think about how all those things interact. So how does your save system interact with the feeling of tension in your game? Does it support it or does it undermine it? How do your control scheme support the things that you're trying to do? How all those things interact is very important. And it means that, I'll talk a little bit about what it means later. But the last part of that is whole or part of the game. So basically, if you're a single designer or a lead designer or creative director, you're responsible for the whole part of the game. And if you're a designer on a smaller subsection of the game, then you're responsible for supporting that vision for the part of the game that you're responsible for. So if you're a mission designer, you're making sure that your mission supports their overall vision in the game. If you're a combat systems designer, then you're making sure that the combat systems support the overall vision of the game. Now, you notice that I say vision holder. I didn't say vision creator. I said vision holder. They're the person responsible for, this is the vision of the project, and then all these other elements, do they fit within this vision from a player experience standpoint. Most likely, you as a game designer in a production environment, whether it be a very large AAA experience with a 600-person team working on a live services giant multiplayer shooter, not down to, but over to a, say a AAA experience that maybe only has, say, only 120 developers working on a linear single player narrative experience, over to an indie developer on a 10-person team where you're kind of the de facto primary designer. You probably wear lots of hats, but one of them is being the designer of the project, down to a solo developer. You're constantly thinking, you're given that vision either by the research that you've done of what that vision should be. If you are that solo developer or smaller team, you've gone out, you've done the research, you understand what you're trying to build. You have a creative vision for what you're doing. You have a vision for the demographic that you're trying to speak to with your game, or generally in AAA, you're handed what that vision is. Hey, we are making a sequel to this game. And the things that we want to address in the sequel is that we want to make it more accessible, or we want to make it, harder or more competitive or more cinematically appealing or more scary or less scary. All those things you're going to be handed to you. And you're going to make sure that that vision is coherent and consistent, and put it together and present it to the rest of your team. And then again, coming back to testing the elements of that game back to that vision. So that was kind of a long-winded discussion. I don't know if some point someone will screenshot this and then completely destroy me on Twitter and tell me why everything that I just said is wrong and everything like that. But that is the definition that I feel fits with game design. It checks the boxes of what you do as a game designer, what your primary end goal is. Now, there's a lot of pieces that go into that as far as implementation, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit next, which is the actual jobs of a game designer. What are the things that a game designer actually does? And that is often something that people, even again in the industry, you could have people on a team that you go to them, an artist, and say, what do the designers on your team do? And they might not know. I don't know. Those are the design folks that are go into rooms and yell about things in whiteboards, and then they come out and I find out that a feature got cut. Or you'll hear the term a lot, ivory tower. Oh, the designers sit in an ivory tower and make decisions about what things are cool and what things aren't cool, and I don't get to input on that. Now, that would mean I would say that the designers aren't doing a great job. But there's a lot of confusion, even between teams and studios. Even between studios, there can be a lot of different expectations of what a designer will do, what skill sets a designer will have, especially when you start getting into the senior level. And a lot of that's driven by the type of games that they're making, and I'll talk through that when I get into the design specialties. But the sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Between studios that are working on the different types of games, they'll have different definitions. But even within teams, they might have different teams in the same studio might have different definitions that can be driven, again, like I said, by the types of games that they're working on. They're going to have different requirements for game designers than other types of games. And I get that question asked a lot of me. Like when I say to someone outside of the games industry, like, even high level people, working in movies and virtual production, they'll say, hey, what do you do as a game designer? And I start on this spiel and they kind of usually goes right over their head. In say, for example, in movies, things are a lot more defined. There is a very clear understanding of where the input of a cinematographer is compared to the input of, a sound designer. But that can be a little more confusing when it comes to games. So that covers every team is different. But let's talk about some of the different design specialties. When you're looking to get into game design, it can be extremely daunting because when you're looking at starting out, that definition that I gave earlier and a lot of the expectation of, what a game designer is, it's very daunting. It's like, I need to, basically I need to be a movie director. I need to know everything about everything, and I need to be able to jump in and do everything. But of course, the bigger the team, the more speciality that you're going to have. And the industry has, mainly for hiring purposes, has tended to focus these types of specialties in. So I'll kind of just run through this list that I came up with. First off is lead designer. Lead designer is a term that's kind of changed roles throughout the years, based on the size of the design team. It used to be, if you had a 5-person design team, the lead designer could just be the person that was in charge of those other 4 people, or it could be the person that was, responsible for the creative vision of the game. Or it could be that the producer of the project was actually the holder of the creative vision of the game. The lead designer's job was to execute their vision. Again, back to that definition, within their part of the game. But generally, a lead these days is generally referred to as someone that is in charge of the team. So there, the kind of buck stops here when it comes to design. So they're responsible for assigning the folks in those roles, mentoring those folks, generally doing management of that, although I'll talk a little bit about design managers at the end of this slide. But lead generally also means you're kind of that higher level, that person in charge of the vision. But it sometimes doesn't. Sometimes there are elements where you may be a lead designer and not actually making the creative decisions when it comes to that. And so you don't always have to aspire to be a lead. There is, a perfectly good career path or good return path of being an individual contributor. Of someone that's an expert in their field in one of these different specialities. So the next term on this list is creative director, game director. Game director or design director or creative director, again, these are used in different ways between different studios. They can mean different things based on the type of game that you're working on and the type of team that you have laid out. And generally what this became was that as teams expanded and as the complexity and vision of games expanded, you used to have a lead artist, a lead designer, a lead programmer. And those three people would be kind of the triumvirate, and they would be responsible for their different sections, and they would kind of fight amongst themselves or go to the producer and ask for who's right to make a decision between the three disciplines. And generally the idea of a game director or creative director was to elevate someone that was, again, responsible for the player experience, the end user player experience, into that group to help make those decisions. So that could have come from the design side. When I was a creative director, obviously I came up from the design side and was much more focused on design. Could come from the art side, could come from the narrative side. Someone's that if a team is working on a more cinematic narrative presentation game, they're more focused on the presentation of the world and the presentation of the character and the presentation of the story and the narrative. Obviously, if you're working on a World War II turn-based strategy game, the creative director probably is more focusing on mechanics and UI and interface of that World War II strategy game versus the narrative that's trying to be told through this World War II strategy game. That there could be a narrative focused World War II strategy game, and the creative director might be really focused on getting all of the historical information correct and things like that. Again, so creative director, game director, design director, generally just taking that lead position and kind of just moving it up to encompass a broader scope, and can be very different between teams. The rest of these are more actual specialities of what the designers focus on. So the first is gameplay designer, sandbox designer. Some studios use that term. Generally, these folks are focused on the second-to-second gameplay, again, based on what type of game they're making. But say in a shooter, Halo, Bungie uses the term a sandbox designer. And in Bungie's terminology, the sandbox is when you're actually in the gameplay. You're in the moment to moment, melee, grenade, weapons fire phase of the game, the core gameplay loop. And that's really a way to think about it. The gameplay designer or sandbox designer, they're focused on what is that core gameplay loop. So if it was Mario, it would be making sure the jumps are really good, coming up with the rule set of how the player interacts with the world. And this is how turtles function and mushrooms function and pipes, how all these things work. And making sure that second-to-second gameplay for the player is the best that it can be. The next is a systems designer. So a systems designer generally, again, and maybe I can stop saying that it applies differently based on the game you're making on. I tend to use the term systems designer as someone who's kind of working that next level up, thinking about the higher level systems and how they interact with each other. Not necessarily the moment to moment, this is how your shield, health, and damage systems work. They're thinking more about how player reward systems, unlockables, progression, how save systems work, just all these different systems that interact with each other. Tracking, narrative progression, tracking world progression, how, in a more open world game, they might be working on things like traffic, all the different things that interact with each other outside of that moment to moment gameplay. That's when I think about systems designers. Combat designers usually are folks in teams that are focused on character to character, synced animation type combat. When we think of something like a fighting game, that's the easiest one, Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, or in, a broader scope game, like something like Assassin's Creed, or, Ninja Gaiden, where you're focusing on, the combat designer is focusing on the actual combat implementation of, your key combos, how the characters interact with each other, how do the animations sync up with each other, what's the combat circle look like for the AI, like all those things, thinking about that combat. That's generally how I use it. Again, there can be overlap between, a combat designer in a first person shooter. Although you don't hear that term too often in the kind of shooter genre, but that's what they focus on. A mission designer or a story designer or a scenario designer, they're generally, what those folks are doing is generally focusing on the narrative flow or the objective flow in any given encounter. In a open world game, it could be an encounter designer. In a more objective based game, or a less linear, not open world game, but something like, say, Ghost Recon. They might be working on the scenario, laying out the scenario for what the player needs to take down. In a linear game, say like a God of War, they might be working on the moment to moment of the specific mission that the player is in right now. So when the enemies are going to spawn, when the events are going to fire, when the things are different events and things are going to trigger in the game. Generally, mission designers or mission scripters or various different terms will be working with some kind of scripting language or built-in mission editor within the game engine to implement those various different things. A level designer is, again, a term that can vary, but a level designer generally is someone who's working to structure the 3D space that the player is going to come into that environment. So, the old school example of this is if you're building a level in Doom, you're a level designer. And, you've got a set of objects with a set of texture sets and a set of AIs, and you're probably the mission designer and the level designer all rolled into one. You take these assets, you smash them together into a level, and boom, you're done. Obviously, with the raising of the visual fidelity of games and the amount of work and content that goes into a quote unquote level, your art team exists now, and it's not just a bunch of assets that the level designers are kit bashing together. Usually a level designer will be working on more of the conceptual layout, the flow, the 3D space, what the gameplay is going to look like. They may be doing early rough outs that then gets handed off to the art team to art out, or they may be working hand in hand with the art team, with a world builder, world designer, environment artist to structure out what this space is going to look like. Again, there can be a lot of overlap between a level designer and a mission designer. They may be the same people, they may be different people. It just really depends on the team and the game. UX design and a UX designer is something that again has evolved over the years and expanded the role of what this is, and generally moved this from generally the kind of the art team over onto the art design team. And again, that can be controversial. I'm sure I just caused some controversy somewhere, but the difference, UX design really grew out of UI design. And when I think about UI and what UI design is, generally what I'm thinking of is kind of shell menu flow. The classic UI of how am I getting into the game, moving through menus, selecting things, choosing options, starting a game, starting a mission, continuing my story. What's that UI flow look like? Screen organization, usability of that. But UX kind of steps it to the next level of, again, thinking about what that player experience is and how all of the elements support the user experience. And again, that comes back to bringing in other elements beyond generally outside of that core gameplay loop that the gameplay designer is focusing on, thinking about how, reward systems support the user experience. Does the reward system break what the high level vision of what the player that we're want to reinforce? So if our gameplay system is all built around stealth and avoiding deaths, and the gameplay designer is designing this super stealth game where the goal that they're trying to implement really is having the player sneak around and not kill anybody, but the reward system of the game gives you 100 coins every time you kill someone, and you get jackpot noises from a casino every time you kill someone. Those two things are in conflict, because the gameplay is encouraging you to be stealthy and not hurt anybody and end this mission in a non-violent way, whereas the UX, the UI of every time you kill someone, this casino sound plays and coins fall across the screen. Those two things are in conflict. So a UX designer will be thinking about those kinds of things, how all of those things come together, and primarily is focused on user interface, UI, but also thinking about controller accessibility and all the various different things. A narrative designer is someone that's focused on the narrative, and the reason this term has grown up and been different from writer, which a lot of times in the past you would either have a separate writer that's not embedded on the team just because of the amount of workload, or it doubled up as the lead designer was the writer. I was the writer on many of the games that I worked on, or a writer, because there's usually not the writer. But a narrative designer is generally someone who is either is focused on the narrative from their high level vision, but also on implementing narrative systems. So in a game like Mass Effect, where you have narrative interaction is a key element of the game, or BioShock, something like that. Or open world game like GTA, a narrative designer might be sitting down and designing out the actual narrative interaction systems for the player. Obviously, there's a lot of crossover here. There's UI, there's UX, there's all sorts of different things. But coming at it from a narrative perspective, they probably also are a writer, and they're probably also writing, dialogue or interactions for the various different scenarios that they're working on. They may be overseeing a writer where, the writer is actually there to just write the prose, or bring the perspective from a narrative or storytelling standpoint. But the narrative designer is not just focused on the high level presentation of the story, but also on the moment to moment implementation of those narrative interactions of the player. Technical designers, much like technical artists, this is a much sometimes controversial subject, but are generally more of the technically minded folks that may be more knowledgeable about tools and tool sets. They may be building or implementing tools for the design team. They may be the bridge between the design team of the types of tools that they need in the game, and the engineering team and the tools engineers that are building those interfaces for the team to implement the features that they need. In a more complicated, say, physics game like on Halo, you would have object designers or technical designers that their job was to make sure all of the physics objects in the world were consistent and everything worked they wanted to do the way that they should work within the sandbox environment. So they were highly technical, capable individuals who were going in and modifying the properties of these thousands of game objects that need to interact with each other in various different ways. So that's where kind of technical designers fall in. And then the last one is a design manager. A design manager is generally a senior level position at a studio whose role is more focused on the people management of the designers. These folks tend to be designers themselves, although sometimes they come from other disciplines. And they may be responsible for hiring. They may be responsible for the kind of human resources of some things. And especially in teams with multiple projects going at the same time, a lot of times what they'll be is kind of the sounding board for the design teams of the different projects to go to as a resource that is outside of the project and looking at a higher level view. and a resource for them when it comes to staffing, when it comes to concept run bys, when it comes to documentation standards and how the different disciplines interact with each other. But that's where a design manager tends to fall. And as teams are very large, you can imagine that if you are a lead designer on a team with 15 other designers, trying to manage that vision of the game while also managing the day-to-day of those employees, i.e., helping them with their various different employee issues, can be a challenge. So that's where the concept of a design manager comes in, thinking about things like ongoing education and making our design staff more well-rounded and bringing in folks to help fill out skill sets and demographics that we may be missing, things like that. So with all that being said, there are lots of other types of designers that you may run into and design. There may be community designers, progression designers, monetization designers, content designers. Something like a content designer oftentimes is used in more open world teams where they're not necessarily the story designer, but they may be designing the systems for, say, like what happens when you jack a car in GTA. That a designer may be in charge of that part of the game of how you interact with that type of content. Writers can be on the design team, like I mentioned before. So there's lots of different kinds, and I may just be muddying the waters with all these descriptions, but hopefully the idea here with talking through some of these different types of descriptions is giving you an idea of it's not just this global thing that you have to learn everything about everything. You can take your specific skill set and apply to these different disciplines and be content experts in those fields. All right, so I'm right at 10:13. So I'm running a little long, but I'll try to get it nailed in for the Q&A right at 10:30 my time. So the skill sets, what are the skill sets that you are going to want to focus on to be a good game designer? Besides liking video games, that is kind of a prerequisite. Actually, you don't even need to technically like video games. You need to be passionate about video games and be knowledgeable about video games and be able to speak authoritatively and factually and in an informed way. I personally would not recommend going into a creative career if you don't like the things that you're working on. I personally probably wouldn't be a great impressionist painter because I'm not really into impressionist paintings. But maybe there are folks out there that hate video games or don't like video games that make good game designers. And I'm sure there's plenty of jaded old game designers that are sick of games that are still quite excellent game designers. But with all of the general things being said, what are the specific technical skill sets that you want to focus on? Well, the first off is the technical proficiency. There are very few game designers in the industry, and it even exemplifies from AAA down to indie that don't have some kind of technical proficiency that they are excellent and experts at implementing. The most common thing that I would say would be scripting languages that can take the form of, that could take the form of programming. It could be writing code in C++ or C#. It could be a scripting language like Blueprints in Unreal. It could be a mission editor that you may have seen if you've made mods for games of someone that's a technical expert of using the tool set that the team has built in scripting to again, do the implementation level of the game design, because you don't want to have to go to the engineering team every time that you need to move a spawner for an enemy from point A to point B. The design team should be implementing that because you need to have a lot of iteration and getting things perfectly right. So you need folks that are technically capable of the implementation level of the design in the game. And the next thing that is a technical proficiency that you should be good at is prototyping. Prototyping in today's design environment is, I believe, one of the key critical skills. And prototyping, can take a lot of different forms. It could be on paper prototyping. It could be, doing things on in the real world on a paper surface to test out things like progression systems. Or if you're working on something like a card trading game, you could test that out, prototype that in the real world. But more likely, it's going to be prototyping in Engine, whatever engine you're going to be able to use, to build something to demonstrate what you're talking about or to play test what you're talking about. For example, on Halo Reach, I did a lot of prototyping where I would go into the engine and build weapon systems. I played with the various different weapons. Sometimes it was, just how do I make this weapon better or more fun? Or sometimes it was from a very specific design standpoint. For example, the focus rifle in Halo came from the fact that I and the team, when everything is a collaborative effort, but sat down and said, the Covenant beam rifle has some deficiencies. It's not rewarding for the player. It doesn't give good directionality in sniper type gameplay in single player, and essentially is seen by the player base as just a weaker, less desirable version of the sniper rifle. So how can we approach a gameplay element that addresses those issues while still being compelling and different? And so the focus rifle was built by myself, taking the Sentinel beam gun, the beam gun from the Forerunner Sentinels, modifying it into a player usable weapon with that same beam, shield drain, and health damage. And then I literally did the math to calculate how long it took you to kill a player with 2 shots with a human sniper rifle, and set that as the time damage scale for the focus rifle. And that was the start point of it. So I prototyped that. We played it. People liked it. It worked out well, and still in Halo, or been in a few Halos since then. So like I said, prototyping is a key skill in whatever technology that you're working in. And I'll talk a little bit about tech here before we wrap for Q&A. So general game dev, the technical proficiency in general game dev, the line goes back to what I talked about earlier. You have to be an expert in everything. And any producer will tell you, if you ask, what do I need to know to be a game designer? Well, you need to know engineering and art and performance and QA and all these things. But you need to have a general knowledge of game development, and specifically the restrictions that you're working in and the technology that you're working in. If you don't understand the concept of how many characters can be loaded in on screen at any one time, and you're going to sit down and just build an environment or write out a design document for a bunch of missions, you're going to be in trouble. Because if you don't understand that you're making an open world game, but you need to have systems that only allow 8 characters on screen at any one time, you're going to run into a lot of problems. So you need to be able to have that general knowledge of performance and optimization, and how many of, from a production standpoint, how many characters we're going to be able to build, how many characters customization options are we going to be able to execute on. It doesn't help you to sit and spend a couple months writing this amazing character progression system with all these various different unlocks and customization on the character and all these various different things when your production environment has no capability of making that in the time that you have to make the game. So you have to have your general game dev knowledge of implementation, optimization, performance, what your pipeline looks like, and things like that. Genre knowledge is, you do need to be an expert in the genre that you're working in. And when I say that, it doesn't mean that you need to be the biggest fan of the genre that you're working in. In fact, oftentimes being a huge fan of the genre you're working in can be a detriment that you have to overcome because you have your personal biases that you're bringing in and what you love and what you don't love. But very shortly after you get a project, if you're working on a pinball game, you need to go out and know a lot about pinball games. You need to know what the competition looks like. You need to know what's coming on the horizon. You need to know what other games have done well and done poorly, and learnings that you can bring in the industry, things that have been tried before, all of that stuff. And most of this you will need to do on your own time. If you are already if you're already a fan of the genre and you understand, what's going on in that space, great. If not, you're going to be spending some late nights playing all of the different types of games in that genre, because the team will expect, whether you're on a 5-person team or a 100-person team, that when they come to you and say, hey, we're working on our new fighting game, how did Mortal Kombat do this? How did Street Fighter do this? How did Soul Calibur do this? You're going to need to know that information. So you will be expected to be, very knowledgeable about the genre that you're working in. And of course, all game development, history is good information, and you can bring elements from different games into your design aspects. Another example from Halo, just because I just talked about the focus rifle, was the skirmisher in Halo Reach. The skirmisher originally didn't have anything to do with the jackals. That was just a visual design that kind of came later. But the skirmisher was designed to flank the player. That was the idea, is that generally in Halo, you had these face-to-face encounters. You would come up, the enemies would take, once you engage the enemies, the AI would spread out and kind of take positions, and you would have this battle back and forth. And the idea with the skirmisher is that they would constantly try to flank around the player and get on the player's side as kind of a skill jump to make the player look left and right, to engage in different directions, so that it wasn't always a forward push and pull once the actual combat kicked off. And the term skirmisher came from in my background came from Age of Empires, in that skirmishers were the characters with poles. They kind of had pole arms, and their idea was to break enemy formations. Is that when you had a group of archers or a group of swordsmen laid out in these amazing RTS formations, your skirmishers would come in and just kind of mess all that up. And they weren't super strong characters. They were kind of in the middle, and they were good against certain groups and certain formations. They were relatively cheap and disposable, and that's where the concept of the skirmisher in Halo Reach came from, and why that name stuck to them, and then later it was applied to make them a variant of the jackals. So let me check my time real quick. And I'm at 10:23. So I'm going to speed this a little bit along. So the next design skill set, the big design skill set, is communication. You can be the expert in all of the things I talked about in technical proficiency, but if you can't communicate with your team, or your player or your community or anybody, you're going to have a hard time as a designer. So I hate to say it, but no matter how introverted you are, you're going to need to work on that. You're going to need to work on your communication skills. Now, of course, again, this is dependent on the team and the team structure, and oftentimes you can and should reach out to your team for help in these kinds of things. Your producer should be a huge resource in how you communicate with the team. Of course, they should be up on all the latest and greatest in team communication, whether it be the newest application, whether it be Teams or Slack or Trello or Confluence or the Wiki or Discord or whatever you're using for communication, things like that. But you need to have these basic communication skills. And the first thing is verbal communication. I know we've been locked down and doing teleconferences and Zoom, and we're all sick of this, and we're, things for a year. But verbal communication skills, the ability to go around and listen to people, listen to their feedback, listen to their ideas, and then communicate that back verbally is incredibly important. So you may find yourself having to go out and interact with people in a verbal communication setting. So if that's something that you struggle with, then you're going to need to work on that, whether it's, speech classes. And when I say speech classes, I mean like presenting speech classes, or just, the various different tutorials that you can take on verbal communication. It's a very important skill set. And I think it's something that people forget about. If nobody likes talking to you, you're going to have a hard time. Your design ideas could be amazing. And if people don't want to talk to you, they better be amazing, because they're going to have to stand on your own, because people aren't going to come talk to you to find out, what exactly you meant. If your next skill set, technical writing or presentation skills are lacking, you need to be able to talk to folks about, what you're doing, what that vision of the game is, communicating that vision of the game. Technical writing is incredibly important as well. I talked a little bit earlier about prototyping, and I do generally feel that prototyping has replaced design documents in general. I feel that building a prototype to demonstrate how a game system should work is 100 times more valuable than writing out a giant document or a design Bible, as we used to say, about how the thing should function. The old school way is you write this giant design Bible, you hand it to the engineering team, and you say, cool, build this. And, once you build all these things, then my design team will come in and we will tweak all the features to an awesome experience. I find it a much better use of time to build a prototype than to try to write, 100-page documentation. Again, going back to that focus rifle, I could have sat down and written a very detailed documentation about how I want this weapon to function, handed it to another designer, had them implement it, and then test it. But it was just much more efficient to actually build a prototype and let someone play it than it is to write it out in a document. However, that technical writing capability, whether it, there are times when you do need to just document exactly how it's going to work. When it comes to, more complicated systems, a prototype might not cut it, or a prototype needs additional documentation of how this is going to work. And then it gets very critical when it gets to the QA time. You need to be able to read and write and correspond with the QA team, with the production team, to write good bug notes, to write various different elements that you're going to have. Technical writing is a key component that's never going to go away, and you need to work on that. Documentation is incredibly important. You need to have that technical writing capability. And then the last thing on communication is presentation skills. Presenting what the game is to your team in various different routes. It could be, a PowerPoint presentation. It could be standing up in front of a team of 100 people and saying, hey, this is what we're going to do. So I am going to present to you. It could be presenting to the players of, if you're a smaller indie team, if you're the designer, oftentimes you're also the press person that's doing all the press interviews. So you need to be comfortable, presenting to the player what it's going to be. Public speaking skills, presentation skills, taking that prototype again. If you build a prototype of a gameplay element, you're not just going to upload that prototype to a server and say, okay, 200 people go play that, and that's what it's going to be. You're going to need to present that in some way, shape, or form. So again, if you have trouble with that skill set, and a lot of us do, a lot of us tend to be more introverted folks or struggle with different elements of public speaking or presenting, you're going to need to be able to get out and present in a clear and concise manner. So practice that skill set when you can. And then the last thing on this slide, before I kind of wrap, I'm not going to be wrapping up. Last thing on this slide is be a salesperson. You need to constantly be selling. And that's why I have the used car salesman up. And when I mean selling, I don't mean BSing. I found that a key element of being a good game designer, especially on a team, is to constantly be polling the team and asking the team for ideas and listening to the team. And then taking those ideas and distilling down what is awesome about that, what works in the design to support the vision, and then to resell that to the rest of the team, and then resell that to the marketing department, and then resell that to the publishing team, and then resell that to the player. You're constantly in sales mode. And so you need to understand the skills of positively presenting and getting people excited and constantly being a salesperson and a banner waver of the vision that is your responsibility to be the holder of. So 3 steps moving forward, the last section. I will hopefully run through this a little bit quickly because I have gone over on time. But the three things that you can do tangibly to move forward in your career in game design, regardless of whether you're a high school student interested in starting a game development program, or you're about to graduate, or you're already in the games industry and you want to move into game design. The first thing that you should do is learn game engines. The chances are that you will be working in some game engine that you did not create and that your team did not create. There are still teams that work in proprietary game engines. But that being said, if you get hired by those teams, or if you sit down and build your own game engine, you are going to be to benefit being well-versed in multiple game engines. Definitely, I'm going to recommend Unreal Engine. You should go check that out. There's tons of resources. It's free and super awesome. And I will tell, I could spend another hour telling you why that's awesome. As a aspiring game designer, you need to be fluent on multiple different platforms. So I definitely do as well go out and get experience on Unity. And I'll talk about how to get experience. Unreal and Unity are the two primary commercial game engines that are used in the industry. So you should be familiar with them both. And you may ask, well, you're an Unreal person. Why would you tell someone to use Unity? Well, frankly, you should use Unity to see as well how awesome Unreal is, and that'll help you appreciate the awesomeness that is Unreal. A third-party engine that is not a big primary commercial engine is a good experience as well. So Godot is an example of an open source engine that you can go and check out for free. Take a look at how they're doing things different. You can also look at the engines that are more focused, like on different elements, like Game Maker, RPG Maker, Twine. Those are good experiences as well. But if I had to pick three right now to at least be proficient enough to build a prototype in, I would do Unreal, Unity, and Godot. Those are the three that I would look at. So within those three engines, how to practically get a skill set is to build prototypes. You should be building content in those engines. And I think gameplay prototypes are the best way for designers to get a touch on the various different aspects. And I am running out of time, so I'm not going to go into the Unreal Engine Marketplace that's available on the Epic Games Launcher. But if you're interested in building prototypes as a game designer, I highly recommend that once you go and get the Epic Games Launcher, download the Unreal Engine, go into the Unreal Engine Marketplace. The Unreal Engine Marketplace contains assets, blueprints, plugins, various different things that you can use to build a game. And they're especially valuable to people wanting to learn systems and people that are, say, game designers and aren't artists and aren't animators and can't build awesome Niagara effect system. You can go and obtain those objects. We do a free giveaway of different assets. I believe like 5 or 6 a month that are free every month. Once you get them, they go into your library. We run sales. We have permanently free collection. This example of a chess prototype that I've been working on for quite a while called Parachess in the lower left. Everything that was built for this base prototype is available for free on the Unreal Marketplace. I built it completely without I use purchase assets for various different demos, but the core game and what you see in that image is all completely free on the Unreal Engine Marketplace. So highly recommend you go check that out. And the last thing, as far as moving forward, is you will never stop learning. Learn. Continue to learn. Engines evolve, game technology evolves, the game marketplace evolves, and you need to continually learn what is out there. And a perfect place to start, since I am an Unreal Engine evangelist working for Epic, is the Unreal Online Learning Academy. So you can go to Google Unreal Online Learning, and there's a set of courses. These are all free. You can register. You can see here I have filtered for scripting in games, and it's bringing up using blueprints, best practices for using plugins, a Kickstarter program for getting started in blueprints, essential concepts, and you can sort by art. You can sort by various different things, programming. These kinds of resources are great. YouTube tutorials, both for Unreal and Unity, are great resources. things like YouTube, Udemy, things like that. But do check the date that those things were made. Oftentimes in tutorial sites or video streaming sites, the most popular videos will be a couple years old, and oftentimes you may run into problems if you're trying to implement, learn how to use a certain feature in an engine. If you're using a year-old video, things are going to be deprecated, things are going to be different. So for Unreal Engine, this is a great resource, and I would look for similar resources on the different engines that you may be looking into as well. But when you find that you eventually want to ship your game in Unreal, because it's awesome, you can come back and check this out for free. There's also badging for students and aspiring folks getting into the industry that can add to your LinkedIn. You can build a portfolio of courses that you've completed, and obviously that shows a lot of gumption to go out and do your own learning outside of your traditional classes that you're taking and projects that you're building for your school. Okay, so with that, I only ran 7 minutes over, so I do want to move into the wrap up and QA phase. Thank you for sitting here for an hour and listening to me talk about kind of the philosophy of what a game designer is. It is a very challenging topic, and I'm sure there's going to be people that disagree with some of the things that I said. This is all based on my experience and my philosophy of game design, which sometimes has been incredibly successful in the past and sometimes been incredibly not successful. So I learned both from things that go well and things that do not go well, and you constantly add that experience to your quiver of knowledge that you can pull out when you run into a challenge in the future. There are no failures in game design. There is only learnings. So with that, I want to give a huge shout out to the West Virginia Game Developer Expo for inviting me back again. I hope this has been useful to everybody. And if you want to follow me on social media, again, at Cerelan, is my Twitter handle. Unreal Indies is a page for folks that are interested in using Unreal for your Indies projects. It also has a link to all the various different evangelists around the world. So we have evangelists. There's a few of us in North America, South America, Europe, New Zealand, Australia. We've got folks, business groups in India and in the Asian regions. So feel free to look at that list for evangelists. If you can't find an evangelist for your region, feel free to reach out to me. Or if you're in North America, feel free to reach out to me. Drop me a DM. Hit me up on LinkedIn. Twitter and LinkedIn are the two primary connection platforms that I use, so feel free to drop me a message if you have any specific questions or you just want to connect. Hit me up there. And with that, I would like to turn it back over to the organizers to handle the Q&A.
Okay, so if people out there have more questions, feel free to drop them in. But I have a couple here. Rob was taking notes while you did your presentation, and he was looking at this from an outsider standpoint, which I think is fantastic because that's the kind of people we're talking about. So what he wanted to know was, when it comes to games being developed, where are those decisions being made? For example, who decides to make a Cyberpunk 2077 or a Candy Crush remake? Where does that happen?
That's a great question. Generally, again, prefacing everything with, it's completely different from team to team and project to project. But, generally, say in a AAA environment, you will have high level folks that are looking at, say, portfolio management, right? A game publisher will look across the board and say, this type of game is something that we want to make, either in this IP that we have, or in this genre that we're lacking, or in this genre that we want to, move forward on. And then they will say, okay, this is the high level game that we want to make. And this is the team that we want to make it because they are excellent at this thing, and then put those two things together. And generally what will happen, say, for example, I'll just use an example for Halo Reach. The way that Halo Reach came about was that Bungie knew that they were going to be making another Halo game, and they generally knew that it was going to be kind of the last hurrah for Bungie. There was 2 projects in development. There was the Peter Jackson Halo movie game project that was moving forward that eventually got morphed into Halo 3 ODST, and then there was going to be this new Halo game, and there was a few requirements. It needed to be a multiplayer game, and it wasn't going to focus on Master Chief. It was going to be something different than Master Chief, because at the time Microsoft was going to be taking over the Halo franchise and moving forward with Halo 4 and with the Master Chief story. And so there was 5 folks. I got hired on specifically for this project. And then there was 4 other folks that had been experienced dev team members from multiple different Halo games in the past. There was essentially a level design, a level builder, a world designer, a producer, a writer, myself as lead designer, and then there was a creative director / art director who was in charge of the overall project. And we basically spent 3 months from that high level concept of it's a multiplayer focused Halo without Master Chief. And then it was like, okay, well, what's that mean? Here's some different high level concepts of what the gameplay focus could be, and very quickly, we settled on, it's going to be the story of Reach. It's going to be a precursor to Halo 1. It's going to be a prequel. From there, what's the style and tone of the game? Well, we want to focus more on, a Saving Private Ryan type presentation versus a, Battle of Midway type presentation, or Star Wars-esque presentation. That Halo 1 through 3 were. And so the 5 of us kind of just banged through that, through writing and presentation and again, salesmanship of going out to the team and seeing what people wanted, and really honed down that presentation. And then we presented that upwards to studio management and to the publisher, to the various different groups, the engineering team. Hey, this is what we think the vision should be. Incorporate their feedback, their yes and no's, what worked from it, what didn't work from it, into that cohesive vision of what eventually ended up being Halo Reach in the end. So I know that's not an exact answer of product visionary specialist title, but that's generally how it works in a AAA studio environment.
Because I figured, if it's an indie, it's going to be the developers. The person has a passion, but I think I definitely understood what he was saying, where in a much larger AAA, is there someone who's in charge of IP that's like, we just acquired this IP, you're going to make this game, developers, that type of thing. So
yeah, and there can be, like Ubisoft has or previously had, when I worked there, an editorial team that's job was to oversee the kind of design vision of the entire publishing apparatus of what is the general approach of the next Assassin's Creed game, and who's going to make it and what's it going to be. And then generally that approach is then turned over to a team to make a pitch back to those folks and go, yes, this is the game that the team wants to make. This is why they want to make it. This is why they think it's going to be awesome. So green light, cool, go do that. Here's your budget. Go do it. So it'll generally be that kind of presentation loop of, hey, especially when it comes with, to sequels, hey, you're going to work on the next game. It's generally not just like, hey, Battlefield, 12 is done. Time to do Battlefield 13. Go make Battlefield 13. When it's done, let us know. It's like, what are you going to do for the next Battlefield and why? And then you get into kind of that loop process. Another example would be a more directed example would be on After Earth. So on After Earth, I was hired. I worked for Overbrook Entertainment, which was the production company in charge of the movie and the franchise in general. Now, the After Earth franchise died when the movie wasn't successful, but like all Hollywood IPs, there were bigger plans. There was a bigger storyline. There was ideas for books and movies and comics and TV and all these various different things. And So I was brought on as the kind of game director for what the video game IP side of the IP was going to look like. And early on in production, when it was 2 years out, 2.5, 3 years out, it was like, this is the scope of what we can do. And here's different pitches, and different publishers were coming in saying, yes, we'd like to publish a game in this. And I was listening to their pitches. And as time went on and decisions, for whatever reason, things weren't decided on, or things weren't executed on, or dates changed, I was focused on what is the scope of the game that can be made within the time that's left that supports the IP, that's not going to end up being a piece of licensed trash that you often see in movie type games. And so when it got to a certain window, I said, not just me, but I said, hey, at this point, you're not going to do a AAA game. It's not going to happen in the next 18 months. You're not going to ship a big game in this IP on Xbox in the next 18 months. You're setting yourself up for disaster. So let's focus on a mobile game. Okay, well, what kind of mobile game fits with this IP? And so I got pitches from multiple different developers where they said, it's called an RFP. You send it out and say, hey, we're looking for a mobile game to support this IP and work in this franchise. And so Behavior came back with a pitch of a endless runner and saying, hey, there's a lot of running and fighting in this game, an endless runner, Temple Run-esque game built in this franchise, seems to support the game, and it ended up kind of, yes, that'll work, that'll ship. And it's funny, it's one of the few movie IP games that the game had a higher review score than the movie. It's usually inverted that way. But that's an example of how those kinds of decisions, that was driven by time, really, not even budget. Like I could have gotten a budget approved for a XBLA game, or even if it had worked out earlier on, a higher budget video game or AAA game. But as the time got shorter and shorter, I was making the call based on my experience of like, hey, if you only have 16 months, I don't care if you spend $20 million. This is going to be a disaster if you try to go with this higher level vision, even though I think this higher level thing would be awesome. But if it has to come out with the movie, this is what you're going to get. And so all those factors kind of drive in together to influence what a game may end up being.
I think that's a great example, because I was about to ask you, before you went into the whole After Earth talk, I was about to ask you, how do the developers know when we're done? Meaning, like, how do they know when they're like, we burned out our funds on this, like we're not gonna have any more positive gains, we need to now start a new project? And in your area as the creative director, that's the person who kind of sees the overarching money and development and talent and projections on what we can sell, and we want to be in the black, not in the red type of thing, to figure out how many DLCs we can have, how long can we stretch this taffy type of thing.
So in the AAA environment, that's generally falls under the role of the producer. So, generally your five, I mean, there's lots of disciplines, but generally your 5 disciplines are your engineering team that's building the backbone of what the game is, or modifying the engine to support what you need to do, writing the code. You've got your art team that are creating all of the beautiful art assets from the concept level all the way to the final shippable assets. You've got the design team that's focused on the vision of what the product is from the player experience, like I talked about. You've got your QA team who's making sure that everything works. And then your production team, your producers, are generally the ones that say, okay, this is our budget. And they may start with a budget, or they may start with a schedule. In After Earth's case, it was driven by the schedule, because the movie was coming out on this date and the game had to ship alongside the movie. Or it could be driven by, hey, we have $25 million and this number of people, and our burn rate is this, thus we're going to run out of money on X. And then they can backfill a schedule from there. And so the producers are generally the folks that are actually sitting down and working through what that schedule is. And that's part of the limitation that's going to be given to you as a game designer. If it's like, hey, you're going to have 6 designers and 2 years, and your team is an experienced shooter team that's worked on, linear based shooter games, like, just to use old examples, like Doom. And you come back with a design for Grand Theft Auto, that's not going to work. It doesn't meet with those things. And so a producer is going to say, like, okay, well, this design looks amazing, but when we take our schedules and add them all up together, that's just not going to work. So you're going to need to go and adjust the game design vision for what it's going to be. And that's one of the skill sets of a designer, is working within those confines. You are, again, unless you are a single developer that is financially independent and you can do whatever you want for as long as you want, you are still restricted. Then you are still restricted by what you can do yourself, or how much you can pay someone to do something, or who you can find to pay to do something. There's always going to be a set of restrictions and limitations on you as a game designer. And that skill set is, again, applying those limitations and those resources back and to that vision of what the project needs to be.
I think it also bears repeating. You just said we're not going to be able to make a AAA game in 18 months. I saw someone on Twitter the other day put out a question, not to industry people, but to lay people, to say, how long do you think it takes to make a model fully articulated for a game and this type of thing? And people were like, I think 30 days, 40 days. And then someone was like, it gets made when the game ships, because you're having to articulate everything, and it's down to the very last second. So I do think there may be, people have some their own ideas of how long games take to make, and they're just like, oh, they're waiting 3 years. No, they're probably not waiting 3 years. They're probably having to finally push it out when they would have liked 3 more years to develop.
Oh yeah, game development can and will and could go on forever, right? I mean, there are games that people are still making mods for and tweaking and polishing forever and ever and ever. Most of the time, the one of the challenges that comes with lay folk, with people that haven't been in the industry and don't understand, is, one, games don't get started when they get announced, right? You see an announcement for a game 2 years before it comes out. If that game's been announced, there's been someone working on that game for quite a bit of time. Now, if things are really tight, say with After Earth, it could have just been a couple months, or it could have been a year before, trying to figure out what's the scope, what kind of game we're going to make, what's the scope of this, or it could have been a team of 100 people banging away on this just to get it to that announce phase, that prototype of what the game might be 3 years from now, that vertical slice, or that gameplay presentation. There's been a lot of time and effort that it goes in, and the same any creative industry, movies, right? The teaser came out and a year later the movie comes out. Well, did they make it within that time? Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead, I think, just finally got announced. I was at Warner Brothers in 2009 when that title was being worked on. I actually worked on game pitches for that at the same time that Inception was being made. So, and Inception came out, however many years ago, and Army of the Dead just came out because Zack Snyder got distracted by, DC. And so there are a lot of games like that where things will be in slow burn. There may be different games within an IP that are being worked on, might be worked on for a while, might be shelved, something like, a shooter within the Command and Conquer universe. Someone may work on a prototype and then shelve that. And then down the road, the publisher maybe decide like, oh yeah, we want to make a shooter, and, this prototype has been built, so let's revisit that. So, the amount of time that goes into things, people outside of the development space generally don't have a good handle on how much time things take.
Yeah, I think it's a good eye-opening situation. In our comments here, William Heckman asks, any tips on monetizing the game?
Well, there's a lot of different routes to go for monetization. Monetization is one of those big challenges that unfortunately is always changing. In the marketplace, I still long for a day where you just build a multiplayer game and, you build it to a certain point and it's awesome, and you ship it and you sell it for $50, and then you make a lot of money and people like it, and then you support it for years and years and years. And it's awesome. The realities of economies today of server hosting and the costs and risk and all those things change that. So really you need to think about when you're thinking about monetization, you need to think about what your game is and what your market is. and how and when and where you're going to sell your game. So the kind of three general models are, one, I sell the game as a packaged product and it is X number of dollars and they buy it and they enjoy it. This works obviously really good for, say, single player games. If you have a single player narrative story game that lasts for 8 hours, you can say, okay, that's $30. You get it. Boom. It's done. You enjoy it. You're done playing it. The next is, a kind of episodic or DLC based model where, maybe you purchase a smaller chunk of the game for a set number, and then there's multiple kind of DLC or content packs that you're buying to add on to the game. Say, Fallout 4, is that kind of DLC based model. And then you have your kind of free-to-play based model, free-to-play or freemium, where it's, the person downloads the game for free, and then the in-game gameplay is monetized. And there's good, quote unquote, good ways of doing that, i.e., cosmetic approach like Fortnite, where, the monetization comes from your cosmetic items, your skins, the things that you're showing off how much you love the game, your battle passes, things like that. There's other monetization where, you may have like a pay to win type situation where you pay more money to access things that you can beat other people. And there's different ways to do that type of monetization. Generally, the approach that I prefer as a game designer, I prefer there be no monetization, that I could just make the vision of the product that I want to make, and money doesn't come into it at all, right? I mean, but that's like it saying, as an author, I want to be able to write whatever book I want and support myself and someone just to pay me to do that. You need to understand if you're making, say, for example, a trading card game, where, RPG style, Magic the Gathering type game, there's a certain type of monetization that people are used to in that space that may be more appropriate for that. And that's where that genre knowledge of going out and understanding the monetization for your genre that you're working in, what customers are used to, what customers are comfortable with, what customers consider predatory or what you feel predatory, what is considered a good deal, all these things kind of come into that. It's definitely not an easy answer, but one that, continually evolves in the industry.
I would say I think it's useful of all these people who've done it before, and you can kind of look online to see whether it's favorable or not. So when I think about Fortnite, I go back to kind of Counter-Strike. I'm going to buy a hat. And so Fortnite has the skins, Fall Guys has your different adorable outfits. I found I've spent more money on Fall Guys. I don't know that you've played it much, Christian, but I mean, it's like you playing Wipeout, basically, if you've ever seen that. Because my 2-year-old is like, oh, I want you to buy that squid. And I'm like, well, I, of course, have to buy the squid outfit for my 2-year-old because she loves it. So that free-to-play game has got more money out of me because my kids are like, ooh, Daddy, I want that outfit.
Yeah. Fallout Shelter, I spent probably $30 on Fallout Shelter, and I was happy to do it. Like, I was like, this is a free game. I don't have to spend any money, but I understand the monetization. I understand what I'm getting for it. I understand what I'm spending the money on. I really like this game, and I want to throw money, even though it's, throwing the money to Bethesda. I still want to support the developer, Bethesda, before they got purchased by Microsoft. I still want to support the title, and I feel good about it. But a lot of, free-to-play games that I see on mobile, I go, I don't want to play that, because I can tell as a designer, I understand looking at it that this is built to monetize me, and I don't want to enter into that experience because I know it's going to be popping up and going like one of the things I had on After Earth was arguing with the publisher where they wanted to have a cooldown monetization where, hey, you've been playing the game for 2 hours. If you want to continue to play the game, you need to spend money. And I was like, no, that is not good for the IP. That is not good for the franchise. We want the player to, if they're going to spend additional money, they want to feel good about it, not feel forced into it. And so it's a touchy thing. It's a hard, nebulous concept that lots of people around the world struggle with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I did. I did also drop some money on Fallout Shelter so I could buy some pets. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
was because They already had me with Fallout 3, Fallout 4, that type of thing, and it felt like playing Tiny Towers, and I was into it. So
Yep.
I think if you go out there and look at the type of games that model what you're trying to make and see what worked for them, what didn't work for them, that might be a good shot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our mutual acquaintance, I think Gary Bradford had a question here. Gary's big into Unreal. He's been recently trying to do some stuff with 2D, and he wanted to know, maybe based on your other talks you've done, I know you're a wealth of knowledge there. Have you done any 2D talks? Because he said it looks like that at least Unreal started to do a push into 2D gaming, but there's some aspects he thinks that they kind of like dropped the ball on, especially when it comes to doing tile mapping. He struggled to get those to work correctly. So have you done any talks? Have you worked with yourself, had some behaviors? Because they started to the 2D realm, but they really didn't pay that off yet with some of those features. And he wants to be able to do more with 2D in there.
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and it's a valid question and valid critique. Unreal was built as a 3D engine, kind of from the ground up, from the 90s when it was first built, and that's been its focus for a long time. There are, and personally, with my skill set, I don't have any, I've never built a game in 2D, so I don't have a lot of good this is where you should go. Paper 2D is a plugin that has been built to help with 2D development in Unreal Engine. So I would definitely look at that if you haven't. I would, but we do on the evangelism team, specifically in our LATAM team, have some big 2D fans and 2D aficionados. So if you have specific follow-up questions, hit me up. I'd love to link you up with those folks on the evangelism team that are passionate and knowledgeable about the state of 2D and Unreal, and where things are planned to go and what you can build in it.
So I have a question here that I think that kind of circles around maybe imposter syndrome, but maybe not quite. There's a lot in this particular industry that seems like there's a psychological barrier to this kind of work. I hear things like, I'm not good at math, or similar comments. Can you talk about that for a minute? How programming overshadows all of it to the people outside the industry, like how they find the reason, I'm not excellent at math. They have no clue how much math is going to be in there before they get into it. But somebody from the outside who's coming in, I guess maybe to say the imposter syndrome never goes away, but talk about since you are in the industry, what were the real barriers? What are they, and demystify the ones that people think they're there?
That's a great question, and imposter syndrome, it's kind of become a buzzword lately, but it is a real thing. And part of the challenge is this, with this specific question, it is exasperated by this lack of definition of what a game designer is, right? And lack of this concept that keeps kicking around for years that you're a Renaissance person, that to be a game designer, you better be Leonardo da Vinci. You better be able to paint the Sistine Chapel and invent gold-darn helicopters at the same time, and be a math wizard and a physics wizard and a psychology major and UX design flow expert. Where I've found in the past is what has helped me is identifying the experts in those fields, right? On Halo Reach, when we were working on the space flight section where you're flying a spaceship through space, I identified that available to our team, we had a designer named Sage Merrill who had worked on, the plane flying game from FOSSA that was on Xbox. It was I forget the name. I'm terrible with names. Worked on a similar game in the past and said, this person should be in charge of the flying section. Because I have never worked on something like this, and I'm going to rely on their skill set and rely on their expertise. So there is a certain amount of math that you need to understand. If you're a gameplay designer, and, for example, I said before, when I was working on the sniper rifle, it was sitting down and going, okay, well, if the fire rate of this weapon is X and it does this amount of damage per X, and I can possibly fire this amount of rounds, it equals this amount of time. And then I'm going to apply that math to something else. Game engines do a lot of the math for you. And, understanding, even if you don't understand necessarily the nuts and bolts behind, lerping between two vectors, as long as you know that you should lerp between the two vectors to get a point between these two world locations, I don't really understand how that math works, but the engine does it for me. My math skills, are relatively low, I would say, to others. And the same thing comes with programming. There's this general idea that all game designers must be expert programmers, right? I don't know how to program. I'm a blueprint scripter. I'm a scripter. All of the engines that I worked in was at Ghost Recon. I used the mission editor and the weapons editor that was built into the engine. In Halo Reach, and the mission scripting language, that was a different kind of scripting language. In Halo Reach, I worked within the Bonobo editor and did not a lot of Halo script. At Warner Brothers, I rarely touched the engine, mainly because we were trying to decide which engine we were using at the time. We're bouncing between LithTech and Cry and Unreal, and a proprietary engine. But when I went indie and switched over to Unreal 3, I was hands-on, but I still hired programmers to do the actual programming in the engine to make sure that the features that were implemented. I was basically doing different levels of scripting. When you're indie on a 10-person team, you're jack of all trades all over the place. So that technical knowledge and ability, again, it's going to depend team to team, engine to engine. That's why you need to be fluent in multiple different engines, or at least knowledgeable in multiple different engines, because that's going to, one, help you primarily. The teams that you're going to be hired by in a AAA environment are either going to be using Unreal, they're going to be using Unity, or they're going to be using their own proprietary technology. And the only way to prep for that proprietary technology, besides making mods for their specific games, is to understand how to change between something like an Unreal and Unity, so that when you get to that proprietary technology, you can go, oh, okay, well, I understand how this, flow relates more to how Unity does it, or this flow works, more like object-oriented design, like in Unreal. I understand how that flow works, so I can adapt to your technology and your scripting language. And everything's going to be different. You can be a master in a certain programming language or a certain workflow, and you move to a different team, and you're going to have to learn new things. So everybody's learning constantly. Nobody is done learning in the games industry, and that's especially true for game designers. We all have imposter syndrome in a certain case. It's going to be there forever. Yeah, unless you're a narcissist, then you think you're awesome anyway, so you're good.
So I know we're running a little bit over, but I have a couple last minute questions if you're cool for it.
No problem at all. I'm happy to answer some more questions.
Okay, so first off, let me scroll back up here just a second, because this is one that I've heard a lot too, and as a person in the industry, I wonder if you could talk about it. Gary brings up game designer, game developer, game programmer. Seems to have different floating definitions depending on who you are, who you interview with. Like, what do those mean to you, I suppose, at Epic?
Yeah, you're right. They change on a team by team, studio by studio, year by year. A UX designer didn't exist when I started in game design. And in fact, when I started in game design, I applied to be an artist at Red Storm. When I got my job at Red Storm, I was a modder. I was making lots of different kinds of mods, weapon mods and mission mods, kind of doing all sorts of different things. And one of the things I was doing was building weapons. And back then in 99, a first person, or actually there was a third person weapon model, was 250 polygons. So my awesome skill set was making something that was 250 polygons that kind of looked like a gun. And I applied to be an artist, and the art director said, no, you're a terrible artist. But we have this thing called design, and they implement missions and use scripted missions. And, are you interested in this? And I was like, well, what do I do as a game designer? And they're like, well, as a mission designer or mission scripter, whatever you want to call it, you're going to be given a level and you're going to script the activities and the objectives and the AI and everything that happens in the level. And I'm like, well, do I have to build the level? And they're like, no. And they're like, I was like, well, what do I have to build? And they're like, well, you don't build, art. You're going to be implementing this. And I'm like, well, do I have to code? And they're like, no, you're going to be working in this editor and this scripting language. And I was like, that's awesome. That sounds like me. That sounds like a great job. So, yes, the terms change. To me, a programmer or an engineer, or sometimes, on the West Coast, they say developer. Developer in some studios means a programmer. Developer in other studios means anybody that's in game dev. I know there's been an argument on Twitter about, who's a developer and who's not. And that's, in my mind, silly and goes on every few years. Is QA a developer, or the HR are developers? And, the description of what a developer is, it doesn't, in my mind, doesn't matter that much. And again, in certain environments, developer means programmer. And, content creator might mean artist, but in a lot of other terminology, content creator means streamer. These terms, they're flexible. And so what you need to look at, the important key thing, is to look at that job description and usually what you're going to be doing, and how your skill set applies to that. Whether you're a QA tester, or a software developer in test, or a test focused game designer, all these things could be the same role at different studios. So I know that's not like a perfect answer, because there is no perfect answer, and you need to look at it on a case-by-case basis, and be prepared. A narrative designer at one studio may just be writing dialogue trees, and they may be designing from a dialogue tree standpoint, where they're like, this character is going to say this, and it's going to branch into this, and they've got this big spreadsheet. Or a narrative designer may be creating that spreadsheet, handing it to a writer to fill it in, and then coming back and going through and going, okay, well, in GTA, when you go into the bar, I'm going to, implement this dialogue option with the bartender that's going to trigger when you get within 4 meters of them. That's, going to turn the lights out and kick on the disco music to trigger this event. The narrative designer could be doing any range of those things within that role.
That's what I figured. I wanted to check, because I know, like, even to talk about something outside of the game development, you talk about Hollywood in general, the term director means something completely different if you're a film director as opposed to a TV director.
Yeah.
Like I always assumed like a TV director, there's a reason, or a movie director, they say action and they say cut, and I thought, that's the person that's doing it. No, they're sitting back in a chair and saying that out loud so that someone else does it. Whereas on TV, they are in the dirt, they are in the trenches. So, like, I don't find it surprising, depending on whether you're talking about AAA or indie, how, like, a narrative creator could be completely different things. But I guess just for some clarification, because I had seen it out there, and I think Gary had as well, he agrees that for him, game development covers it all. If you're a game developer, you got to be dealing with all the aspects of it. So, and I have another question here from William Heckman, asking about explain data-driven design, and it's becoming more popular, and how is that better from object-oriented design?
I don't have a good answer for that, because I would need to go research what is currently meant by data-driven design and why it's becoming more popular. Are we talking about, yeah, I would have to dig into what exactly is meant by that. So
I thought maybe you'd know, because I personally was not sure. So if William, if you want to clarify, I can give him my last question here, and maybe we can swing back around and clarify. Maybe he'll really give you a better answer. My last question for you was mainly an open-ended one, Christian. The idea of wanting you to have this talk was definitely for people who had the spark of interest in doing game development, to hear about it, to hear how to get into it. So what advice or what kind of advice would you give to, say, a high school student who wants to get into the industry in general? Where do they start?
So definitely I would, that's a great question. If you're at the high school level and you're trying to figure out what to do to supplement your education path, and your education path may go through, a game development focused path, or it may go through a traditional path. There's game designers that have, education. I personally have a game focused degree, although I went back and got mine after I was already in the game industry. But there's also plenty of game designers that have, their background can be in engineering, their background can be in architecture, their background can be in psychology or history or anthropology. There's all sorts of backgrounds that apply to game design specifically. But the thing, going back to the advice that I had in the talk, go get a game engine. I personally recommend Unreal. If you want to check out Unity or Godot or some of the, Game Maker, some of the others, but get a game engine and start building a simple game in that engine. Pick an existing game that you want to replicate. And when I say existing game, I mean something like checkers. I did a presentation with the Xbox team a few weeks ago where I was presenting the prototype that I'm working on, Parachess, and one of those team members was actually building checkers in Unreal, and they were learning a lot from it. And I kind of sympathized with them because I was like, I wish I had chosen checkers too, because I would be done, because chess is way more complicated than I thought. But rebuild Uno in a card. If you rebuild Uno, that will introduce you to a ton of different elements within that game engine, the UI that you need to build, how objects interact with each other, and then starting to make game design decisions. If you're making Uno, well, what's my gameplay? Is it just going to be a 2D where I'm clicking and choosing cards? What's Uno look like in virtual reality? Maybe I want to build a prototype of what that looks like. And then you're going to be, working with the interaction and how am I selecting things? Sorry, a board style game, building that in Engine. But what those do, by picking an existing game like that, you have your design template and your scope. And then you're deciding how you want to implement that. If you choose Sorry as a prototype, and obviously you would only choose something like Sorry that's trademarked if you never plan to release it. If you plan to release it, maybe choose something like Go that is public domain. But I'll use Sorry as the example. You've got, if you're not familiar with Sorry, you've got 4 pieces and you're moving around the board and get them to your home, and then you slide around, and anyway, it's a relatively basic game. Just looking at that, you've got the rule set built, so you're not going to do feature creep, because if you're a game designer, you're going to want to make it better. You're always going to want to make things better. And so you start implementing, and then you go, oh, well, that's not good enough. I'm going to make it better, and then you never get to the full game. But you've got your rule set, and then you're deciding, well, okay, is this going to be a 2D game? Is this going to be a 3D game? If it's a 3D game, how am I going to, implement it on the screen? How am I going to implement the interactions with it? Am I clicking characters and dragging them around? Am I just highlighting which spaces or things? And then you build that, you get it functional. Do I want to implement multiplayer? Do I want to have, Sorry be me versus the AI? Do I want to build an AI that's making smart moves in Sorry, utilizing this already built rule set that I need? I don't know if anybody's ever built an AI for Sorry, but you could in Unreal Engine. You could build a decision tree, a behavior tree for the AI. So all of those things will teach you, and you will learn, and you will not just be making something that you think is cool, but you're actually working towards a design, and keep your scope within process. And then once you get to that point, then how do I improve this? How do I make it better? How do I make it more exciting? How do I make Sorry look super awesome? How do I bring cinematics into Sorry? How do I bring player rewards, or have multiple games, or change the rules, or have player options, things like that. And then go back and do it again. Do it for a different game. Then do Go. Then do Mahjong. Build these prototypes. And that's not only you're learning you're building a portfolio, you're keeping up with technology, you're understanding how the game systems work, and you're not just kind of starting projects and throwing them away, which I see a lot with aspiring developers.
Yeah, I remembered one of your previous talks at the Expo where you talked about, shipping a game. You don't no matter what the game is, you don't understand how much experience and knowledge you're going to get from finishing that finish line. And so doing that is great. And then you also mentioned the portfolio. I feel like we talked previously about the idea that when it comes to your portfolio, if you're going to go show up at some place, they want to see works that you've done personally.
Yes.
I think the old adage is, don't show up with a bunch of assignments you had in a class. You had to do those. You better show up with something else that you already want to do. Show me your passion. Show me what you wanted to do. Because if it's a drag for you to make your own game or to show me what you're going to do, why do I want to hire you? Like, you don't have ambition. You're not doing this in your free time. You don't love this. There's no passion there. So be doing some of your own extra projects and actually complete them.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to toss out is modding can be an excellent starting point for that. If you're a fan of a game that has modding capabilities, Ark is a great example. Fallout 4 has robust modding community. StarCraft, Counter-Strike, which is Half-Life, which is a mod. But modding can be a great way to start as well, because it's a little less intimidating, because you've already got a structure that's already built, and you're basically editing the structure that already exists into your vision. And I've hired I was a modder when I got hired, and I've hired modders straight into game design positions as well, because I was like, well, if you can pick up this relatively undocumented skill set for these mod tools and implement what you implemented in their game engine, then you can do the same thing as a developer in our game engine. So, one of the nice things about mods is you've already got that defined box to work in. Whereas, when you start with Unreal Engine, depending on how you choose your install options, I recommend always starting with one of the existing templates, first person, third person, side scroller, things like that. But if you just open up blank canvas, it's like opening up Photoshop and hitting new and then looking at the screen and going like, what can I create in Photoshop? It's sometimes it's better to start with already existing things that you can put your own stamp on. And those mods, can and should live on your portfolio. There's lots of indie game developers that started out doing total conversion mods. Even there's indies that I've worked with that their first game was a Mech Warrior BattleTech total conversion of Crysis. I believe it was called Mech Warrior Living Legends, and now they're working on their own game in Unreal Engine. So definitely, I don't want to leave that off the table either for working on your portfolio and your experience.
Well, fantastic, sir. Thank you so much for coming today, or virtually coming today, and talking to us and talking to everybody about what it takes to get into game design and your trajectory, and how there's not just one single road to get in. There's a lot of different roads, and everyone can come in their own way. And if it's something you love, then they say if it's something you love, you'll never work a day in your life. If you're really passionate about it, go out there and get into it. There's lots of ways to learn about it. So thank you for highlighting several of those ways for our audience out there.
All right. Well, thank you very much. These were great questions, and I hope this presentation was useful for the attendees.
Yeah, fantastic as always. Thank you very much, Christian.
All right. Have a great day.